If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Acts 23. This is where we will spend our time. Paul has become a kind of a magnetic north, like the center, the eye of a hurricane, if you want to call it that. And around him, there's a lot of stuff happening. Lots of things are going on. And for Paul, it would appear from Paul's perspective, being in the center of all this mess that he is in, and it's going to get worse for him. It would appear, if I were Paul, I would look at the events of Paul's life at this point, and I would think things are just wildly out of control. I'm caught up in it. I don't know what the future is going to hold. That would be my perspective in every aspect of this. Yet, and this is something very, think about Paul from the standpoint when he was Saul of Tarsus. I mean, how could he imagine all this stuff that's happening to him? He couldn't begin to even think like that in his mind, and yet here he is. I'm going to say that for Paul, at this point in his life, and for every one of us, that when we are at the center of God's will, we're at the safest place we could ever be. Let's look at this text. Verse 11 is where I'll begin in chapter 23. Paul has been brought back to the barracks. He's in custody now once again of the Romans. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify about me in Rome." Next morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy, a group of zealots, and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders, and they said, "We've taken a solemn oath before God not to eat or drink anything until we've killed Paul. Now you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander, Claudius Lysias, to bring Paul back to the barracks, back to the Sanhedrin from the barracks once again, in order that you could ask him more questions, and we are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister, Paul's nephew, heard of the plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. And Paul said, "Take one of the centurions and go and tell Claudius Lysias, take this young man to the commander and tell him what it is you know." So the centurion took Paul's nephew to Claudius Lysias, and the centurion said, as the commander took the young man aside, he drew him aside and asked, "What is it that you want to tell me?" And the young man said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting to get more accurate information about what all's going on, but don't give in to them. Because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for Paul, and they have taken an oath before God not to eat or drink until they've killed him, and they are waiting for your request to bring Paul to them." The commander dismissed the young man and cautioned him and said, "Don't tell this information to anyone." Then he called his centurions and ordered them, and he said, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide mounts for Paul so that he may be taken safely to the governor Felix." All right. So there's a lot going on. I mean, Paul is at the center of this whole episode. There's all this machinery around him, and yet Paul doesn't really understand what the machinery means. But there's a third rail. You've got the Roman machinery, you've got the Jewish machinery, you've got Paul involved in it, and yet there's a third thing operating here, and that is that God is superintending all of these events. These aren't just random things that are occurring. And Paul is in perfect safety here. He doesn't know that. How do I know that he doesn't know that? Because Jesus comes to him and says, "Be of good cheer. You've testified about me in Jerusalem. I'm sending you to Rome to testify there." From Paul's perspective, until he hears that from Jesus, the wheels have come off. I mean, Paul came to Jerusalem to be part of the festival of Pentecost. You read through Romans and you see Paul saying, "I want so desperately for my countrymen to hear the gospel." He's in Jerusalem. He wants to bring the gospel. He can't. That whole ministry is done. All he did was say the one little word, Gentile, and everything came off. All the wheels came off. And isn't it interesting what a tender thing it is that God does here in coming to Paul. In the barracks, he's in custody, and God comes to him in that, I'm going to say, a moment of distress, because Paul doesn't know all these things, and says to him, you're going to Rome. You're going to be all right. I've got you. Jesus says something to Paul that only Jesus is recorded to have said in the whole of the New Testament. Did you know that? He says, be of good cheer. That's one word in Greek, tharai. Tharai. Jesus said it here. He also says it to us. Said it to the disciples. He said, in this world you will have trouble, but be of good cheer. Same word. I have overcome the world. Only Jesus uses that. Now, there's a plot. There's a fourth thing going on. There's a bunch of Jews. They've read Deuteronomy 28, and they're saying Paul is going to upset our apple cart with God. They're focused on messianic thinking. They think the Jews have been looking for the Messiah now for 50-something years. And they still are. Even though the Messiah has come and they didn't recognize him, they're still stirred with this messianic hope. And this group of zealots known as the dagger bearers, they would do anything to make sure that the second half of Deuteronomy 28 did not happen to the Jews, and that the Messianic kingdom would come, and that the Romans would be thrown off, and the Jewish nation would become the center of the political world. They would do anything to bring that about. Did you know that during the 4 years of the siege of Jerusalem, during the Jewish war, the dagger bearers were killing the Jews inside the city walls that tried to get out? That's how serious they are about this. Titus, the general, said, look, if you'll just come out, any of you that will voluntarily come out of the city, I will restore you to your homes. That's the Roman general Titus. And there were people in the city that would kill those who attempted to escape. They were the dagger bearers, the zealots. Jesus had one of those in his group, Simon the Zealot of the 12. They have no, we use a word, they have no truck with the Romans. They don't care about the Romans. They want the Romans driven out. They see them as a subjugator to their nation. So they make a vow. They say, God, and this is exactly the way the text reads. It may not read that in your translation. God will curse us unless we kill Paul. The word is anathema. In other words, God can damn us unless we kill Paul. We will not eat, we will not drink, and God, you can curse us. Same word Paul uses in Galatians chapter 1. If we or an angel from heaven should come and preach to you any gospel other than the gospel which you've received, let him be anathema. Same word. So they've put themselves under this vow. And look, for the Jewish mind to say that I will allow God to curse me if I fail, that's not a lightweight thing to say for them. It is for us. You know, you're on a schoolyard and you try to tell a story about a UFO you saw, and your schoolyard buddies say, I don't believe you. And you say, oh, I swear to God it happened. Don't we? People say that all the time. That doesn't mean anything. To these guys, it meant everything. They were willing that God would curse them if they failed to kill Paul. And look at how God does something about this. We're so caught up in our minds that God has to do something spectacular in order for his will to be carried out. Because we look through the Old Testament, we see the Red Sea part. We see Joshua's hailstorm. We see the sun and the moon stop. We see all kinds of things. We see Elisha show the armies of God to Gehazi. We see the prophets of Baal and the fire that comes from God. We see all that. That's a wrong view. There are things in your life and mine right now, that God is doing, and they look very ordinary. But if we're in the center of God's will, that protection is for us too. Well, this is ordinary. Paul's nephew overhears the plot. Comes to Paul. Paul sends the nephew to Claudius Lysias, to the centurion. The centurion goes to Claudius Lysias. Claudius Lysias is informed of the plot. And the whole plot is stopped. The whole plot by something as practical as a little kid showing up and hearing the plot. I want to continue with the text now, and I'll begin in verse 25. Claudius Lysias writes a letter to Felix as Paul is going to be taken to Caesarea. Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, Governor Felix. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he was a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him. So I brought him to their Sanhedrin and found that the accusations had to do with their law. But there was no charge that I could find against him that was deserving of death or chains. So when I was informed that there was a plot to be carried out to kill him, I sent him to you at once and ordered his accusers to go to Caesarea as well to present their case against Paul. And that's the end of the letter. So the soldiers carrying out their orders took Paul with them by night. And they brought him as far as Antipatris, which was the next town on the way to Caesarea. When they got to Antipatris, they sent everybody but the cavalry back to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived at Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor Felix, and they handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province was Paul from. And learning that he was from Cilicia, Governor Felix said, I will hear your case when your accusers arrive. Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. Okay. So Paul's whole work of evangelism is now taking a detour. He's no longer, in his mind, he's no longer able to go to the Jewish nation. So now this detour has taken place. God is orchestrating these events. He's sending Paul to Rome. And through all of this, you just see God's impenetrable care for Paul. Nothing can touch Paul except that which God allows. Nothing. Think about it. And again, this is the kind of care that we get when we're in the center of God's will. That's just how it is, even though we can't see the mechanics of it. Claudius Lysias writes a very careful letter to Felix. I don't know if you noticed that or not. He leaves out all the parts about where Paul was put in chains. He leaves out the part where Paul was bound to the column where he was going to be flogged because Paul's a Roman citizen. You might say, I wonder why Claudius did that. In the Roman Empire, there were people who assumed power who were not good people, and Felix is one of them. Felix is a slave. He's the only slave that rose to the rank of government official in Rome, in the history of Rome. He's a known person in Roman history. They gather all the troops, 470 troops, by the way, that were given to protect Paul on his way to Caesarea. Why is that? Well, the road from Jerusalem to Antipatris was one that went just like the road to Jericho. It was through all the little rocky crags. It was very dangerous. There were robbers that were known to inhabit the crags. You didn't travel there at night. They go at night, 470 soldiers strong. They get to Antipatris, and 400 of the 470 go back, leaving the 70 cavalry. Why? Because the land spreads out into an open plain at that point, and so you can see people for miles. There's no need for quite the contingency of military that they have protecting Paul. Felix, this former slave, has now been made governor of Judea, the same governorship that Pontius Pilate occupied during the time of Jesus. He was noted in Roman history. He got the post because Claudius Caesar liked him. 53 AD, he is given that post, which puts all of these events right around 53 or 54. We can date the events of all of this very carefully because we know when Felix assumed that leadership role. Felix was said by the Romans in their history to live as a slave with power and money. Now you can imagine what kind of person. We think about Henry VIII in England, and all the wives that he got rid of and then acquired new women throughout his life because he was king. We think that's terrible that Henry VIII died, of all kinds of diseases brought on by the massive health issues that he had because he could live like he wanted to. Felix is like that. Felix was said by the Roman historians to have a terrible temper. He was moody. He had married 3 times. The wife he had now was one that he acquired through adultery. So when you think about Paul's situation, to be brought before somebody like that is even worse. He's in worse worse place than he ever has been at this point in his life. Felix it was written of him that he lived like an uneducated, highly paid animal. So you imagine you're arrested and you get brought into this guy. We talk about judges here, don't we? We think about somebody who sits on the judge's bench and they like this person or they dislike this person. We call somebody the hanging judge, or we call somebody the nice judge, or whatever. Felix is beyond all of that because he has absolute power. He has the clout of the Roman government behind him, and if he decides, because he's in a bad mood, maybe Drusilla burned his toast that morning and he shows up to make a judgment and he just decides away with him. This is the kind of situation Paul is in. The Jewish nation is stirred up. That's part of the problem right now. They've been stirred up for a couple of decades. In the 40s AD, Caligula, the emperor at the time, said, I want to set an image of myself up in the Jewish temple. Well, you didn't set up an image of anything in the Jewish temple, because you couldn't have any images in the Jewish temple, because God can't be represented by an image. And so that created a stir. And there have been lots of things like that up to this point, plus the fact of the messianic fever that is in Jerusalem at the time and the need that they feel to get rid of the Romans. All of this, you can go back and read the histories according to Josephus and Philo and see what kind of environment Paul is involved in right now. Now I want to take all of this information and make something of application for you and I today. It's easy for you all to look at somebody like me or anybody who stands in a pulpit and say to yourself, because of the way the presentation goes, I can say words to you all like, when we are at the center of God's will, we will be at the place of greatest safety no matter what things look like. And I can say that and you think, well, that's really nice. I like that. But don't mishear me. I'm not saying to you that I am altogether there, and now I'm trying to teach you to be like me. Don't hear that, because I live right where you do. I see all of the things that are going on around me in my life, within my relationship with my wife, our son, this nation. I mean, just this morning, I was getting things together here for the service and my phone goes ding, ding. And so that means that something of newsworthy importance has come into my phone, whether it's a text from one of you or something from the news. Well, it was something from the news. What did it say? It says, Donald Trump says that diplomacy will no longer work with North Korea. We have to step it up to military intervention. So in my mind, I'm standing here I'm all by myself, except for the Lord. And I'm thinking I can see the mushroom clouds coming up all around now. What in the world is going on? So it's easy. All I've got to do, if we want to see ourselves at a place of having the wheels come off, is go to the doctor. Right? You go to the doctor says, can you sit down? You know when they tell you to sit down, it's not going to be good. And the doctor tells you or me something that changes everything about our life in an instant. I've been there. I've seen it happen. You have too. Yeah. The center of God's will is the safest place we could be. What does that mean? Well, a lot of it has to do with how we look at safety, and a lot of it has to do with how we look at what our lives are here for. As I was preparing for this, I read a bunch of stuff, and I think, can anything here be useful? Because this is for me, I'll just tell you for me, this is a hard word for me. It is. If I go to the doctor Monday, I don't have an appointment on Monday, but let's say I did, and the doctor says, Rip, the only way we can save your life is to amputate both your legs. What is that going to mean for me? When I think about being at the center of God's will, that all sounds really good until all of a sudden things don't look good. Paul is like that. That's where Paul is. He's going to stand in front of Felix, this highly paid, powerful animal who could decide anything. I think Paul should be strung up and burned to death alive. That's what I think. Felix could have said something like that. He had that capacity, he had that power, and he had the disposition for it. Well, I was reading and I came across an article, and it was an article from the 20s. And I thought, wow, this says a lot. There was a man by the name of Raymond Edmond. You may have never heard of him. He and his wife were missionaries to Ecuador. And at this time in history, they weren't missionaries to the cities of Ecuador. They were missionaries to the wilds of Ecuador, the jungles, the tribal people that lived out in the bush. It's 1920. All right, let's say that one of you in here decides to go to, I have a friend who just came back from South Africa, and they went into the villages. What happens if you get a passport and you get everything ready to go to South Africa? What happens? You go to the doctor, and they fill you full of all kinds of a cocktail of chemicals to keep us from catching whatever it is that exists on the ground when we arrive in South Africa. In the 20s, they didn't have any of that. So a lot of missionaries went into the wilds of the world, and they caught some of the diseases that were there. Well, Raymond Edmond caught typhus. Now, in the 20s, if you caught typhus, your life was in the balance, even in this country. But in Ecuador, in the jungle, you were surely in the balance. So they realized they could not treat Raymond Edmond on the ground in the village where they were. They said, we got to put him on a train and send him into the city in Ecuador to see if they can help him at the hospital. They put him in a hospital, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, didn't get any better. Doctors came to Raymond Edmond's wife, this was about 1926, and they said, go ahead and make the arrangements. You need to make the arrangements. He's dead. There's nothing we can do. He is not going to recover. So she said, okay. She went and she found a church. She found a pastor. She bought a coffin. She did not have a formal funerary dress. So she took her wedding dress and dyed it black. She has made all of the arrangements. She's booked the church for July the 4th, 1926. We're going to have my husband's funeral. Then you telescope the clock ahead 41 years. And you find Raymond Edmond standing in the pulpit at Wheaton College as the 4th president of the college, giving the address to the college students for the chapel. He closes his Bible. He looks up at the crowd. He turns to step off the podium and falls dead as a wedge right there. 41 years later. It doesn't matter what our lives look like. If we are in the center of God's will, we are perfectly safe. God had a job for Raymond Edmond. And it wasn't over until 41 years after he was pronounced dead on arrival with typhus. God had a job for Paul. And with all of the terrible things that were happening around Paul, he was in the center of God's will. And nothing was going to happen to Paul until he completed what God had for him. And God has a job for us. And until God is done with us, nothing can touch us. Nothing outside of his will can touch us. I don't know where everybody is. I don't know where you all are in your life. But if you have any questions for me, you want to speak with me, pray with me, I'll stay as long as it takes. As